So you have a job, at least I'm assuming you do, and you work really hard at that job, clocking in every morning, waiting for the hours to pass by, heading home every night, and every 2 weeks you get a nice paycheck rewarding you for your work. Even if you love your job, ultimately money is a big part of why you're there. So what if I told you that the money that you're working so hard for is being wasted as soon as you deposit it into your bank account? Okay, the word wasted might be a bit dramatic, but it's true that you can often lose money by having it sit in a bank account, and some bank accounts cause you to lose more money than others. Let me explain. When you keep money in a checking account, your money just sits there. It doesn't earn any interest. And this is okay because it's meant to be used as a money hub, a place for your paychecks to be put into and your bills to be paid out of. Ideally, you don't keep very much money in there. You just have enough to pay your bills. Then there's your savings account, and here's where it gets interesting. When you use a savings account, you plan to have your money stay in there for a while, right? And the bank that you use wants you to keep a lot of money sitting in a savings account for a while because then they can use that money to earn more money for themselves. So they thank you for keeping this money there by paying you interest. But the problem is that the interest rate they pay you in exchange for depositing money is typically lower than inflation, which means the money that you're saving will be worth less and less over time. And no, you won't actually see your $100 turn into $95. Instead, that $100 that you worked for and saved away will now only buy you $95 worth of stuff, aka your purchasing power, or how much you're able to buy with the money you have, has gone down. Now there's a few solutions to this problem, but the easiest one, the quickest fix, is to use a savings account with a high interest rate. The thing is, most people don't do that. In fact, most people keep their money in the absolute lowest possible saving account options. Why? Doesn't that sound a little bit crazy? And it is crazy. As a collective, people in the US have missed out on over $600 billion worth of free money since 2014 by sticking with lower interest rates. And guess which banks offer these lower rates?
Crazy enough, it's the biggest and most trusted banks that offer the lowest interest rates on savings accounts, and people usually choose the largest banks as opposed to the banks that have the highest interest rates. That $600 billion number comes from comparing what people could have earned had they ditched the top 5 largest banks for the top 5 banks with the highest interest rates. In the US, that means comparing Bank of America, Chase, Wells Fargo, Citibank, US Bancorp to PNC Bank, Tab Bank, Citizens, Lending Club, CIT Bank. And listen, both of these two different groups of banks have a vastly different amount of money that's kept within them. In the third quarter of 2022, those 5 largest banks held $2.4 trillion. Yes, trillions of dollars in consumer saving and money market accounts. So basically any type of savings account. That's half of what's held by all commercial banks. According to the FDIC website, there are 4,703 banks that they cover. So that means that out of about 4,700 banks in the United States, 5 of them hold half of all the money that people have in savings. So that's half of all consumer savings in 0.1% of banks, and the other half in 99.9% of banks. Anyways, the point is that a lot of people keep most of their savings in the biggest banks. And like we said before, the biggest banks tend to have the lowest rates. Look at this chart of the top 5 banks and the interest rates they offer for their savings accounts. They're all between 0.1% and 0.15%. That means that for every $1,000, you're either earning between 1 cent and $1.50. So basically nothing. And if you're thinking that that's just how it is, well then you're wrong. Take a look at this chart that shows the highest interest rates available. They range anywhere from 3.6% to 4.25%. That means that for every $1,000, you'll earn anywhere between $36 to $42.50 in interest. And that's a huge difference from the $1. And keep in mind that as you save more and more, the more that difference becomes even more impactful. Clearly, there's a big difference between how much you can earn with a high interest savings account. So I think the next logical question is, why are people choosing to stay with the big banks instead?
Okay, so before we get into that, I want to touch on the fact that interest rates actually did used to be higher in the past. Now, as someone who's only been alive since 1996, in my lifetime, the rates have always been extremely low at these traditional financial institutions, like under that 1% mark. But in the history of banks and all the way up until the 1990s, interest rates actually did used to be a lot higher in Canada. Look at this chart. You can see that throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, interest rates fluctuated a lot, between 5% and 19%. So even when rates were low, they were still a lot higher than they are today. And these numbers mostly went up and down based on the current inflation rate. Inflation rates and interest rates are tied together because at a high level, when inflation is up, the central bank wants people to stop spending money to help it go back down. And how do they get people to stop spending money? They increase interest rates so that people be incentivized to save instead. So now look at this chart with the inflation rate added in. You can see the correlation between them, and how when the inflation rate was around 10% in 1980, interest rates were at 19%. And then how inflation rates were around 4% in 1984, interest rates were around 7%. So interest rates follow the inflation rate up and down, and it's always higher than inflation. But all of that changed in the 1990s. See how the chart just completely flatlines? Going on past logic, wouldn't that mean that inflation rates have flatlined too? The answer to that is not really. Inflation has been a lot more in control, hovering between 0.17 and 2.91% between 1993 and 2020, but that's still a lot more movement than the interest rate line. And also, interest rates have now been consistently lower than the inflation rate. Now, all of this was really put to the test over the past 2 years, when the inflation rate jumped up to 3.4% in 2021 and 6.9% in 2022. Now, did big bank savings account interest rates jump up substantially during that time? No, they pretty much stayed the exact same. But some saving account interest rates have gone up as inflation rates have risen. High interest savings accounts found at credit unions and online banks have grown as high as 3 to 4% over the past year, which is still lower than inflation, but much, much higher than the rate that the big banks have been at for decades now. So why are people still not making the switch?
So we did a poll with our Instagram followers to see their thoughts on high interest savings accounts, and here's pretty much what they said, right? So first off, over half of the people that answered, so 56%, said they do use a high interest savings account, which is, once again, that's really amazing because we talk about them all the time on the channel. And then of the other half, so let's say 44% who said they don't or don't know what that means, the reason is split between a couple different things. So 13% said they trust big banks more, so because of that, they don't want to switch. 51% said they're not educated on it, right? And then 13% said they haven't cared to look into it. And then of course, some people did answer other as well, but they basically just listed off similar reasons to the ones that we had already kind of shown to them. Now let's touch on people trusting big banks more. So to me, this makes a lot of sense because bigger banks have more money to advertise themselves and really build out that customer trust. And we know that the more you feel like you know a bank, the more you feel like your money is safe there. And we also know that a lot of people have a lot of fear when it comes to losing all of their money. For some people, it might be really extreme to the point where they're stuffing money into their mattresses. While for others, it might not be as extreme, but it's still to the point where they trust banks, but not some banks. But institutions like CDIC in Canada and FDIC in the United States exist to protect your money in case of a bank failure, which once again, we actually haven't seen since 1996 in Canada, but in the US, we saw this during the 2008 financial crisis and literally just the other week with Silicon Valley Bank. If your bank does fail, you're guaranteed to get your money back up to $100,000 in Canada and up to $250,000 in the US per insured account. And again, this isn't just for the big banks. Like I said earlier, FDIC covers 4,703 banks and CDIC covers approximately 114 banks, so your money is just as equally as safe at any insured bank. Another reason why people aren't leaving the big banks is because they just don't know about high interest savings accounts. There isn't a lot of information or education on them, and usually when people hear something new, especially when it comes to like financial concepts, they need to hear it several times before they truly feel comfortable with it. Now, because the majority of people aren't switching banks, kind of like how we were saying earlier, how half of consumer savings are in the top 5 big banks, this means that the big banks don't need to offer higher interest rates, right? They have so much money and so many consumers that they don't really need to incentivize people to come by spending that much money. Instead, they spend money on advertising and different features like mobile apps and online banking platforms, which, believe it or not, is actually a lot cheaper for them than them raising interest rates.
And on top of that, since they aren't passing much money on to consumers, when the Fed raises interest rates like they have been over the past year to try to combat inflation and bring it down, the big banks end up making a lot of extra money in profit. Let me break that down a little more for you. Remember, when inflation is high, in order to bring it back down, the Fed or central bank will increase the interest rates for banks. And they can then pass that back on to their consumers by increasing the interest rates for savings accounts, incentivizing them to save. And they do increase the interest rates just by very small amounts, much less than their interest rates are being increased. And the difference between the interest rates for the banks and the interest rates that they pass on to their customers, that difference is all profit that they can keep in their pockets. Now, online banks and credit unions, on the other hand, actually did pass on these increased interest rates to their customers. And in the third quarter of 2022, there was the largest gap between how much interest people who use these high interest savings accounts earned versus people who use the big 5 banks. And it's only going to keep growing as interest rates go up more and more. Now, technically, not everyone could actually move to these higher interest accounts because, in theory, if everyone everyone left the big banks and started going to these high interest accounts, they wouldn't be incentivized to offer those higher rates anymore and they could be lowered. But at the same time, it's highly unlikely that everyone is actually going to end up leaving these big banks, especially considering how crazy the disparity is right now. The other thing that's important to touch on is for all the people out there who say things like, just don't save your money at all. You should be investing all of your money. It's the only way to beat inflation. I agree with you because we are very much pro investing a lot of your money, and it is actually the only way to truly beat inflation. But at the same time, people are always going to be saving money, whether that's their emergency fund for any short-term expenses like a trip, events, buying a house, or just because people are cautious. We even asked our Instagram followers as part of that poll before where people keep the majority of their money, and about 50% of people said in their savings. So as long as people are saving money, we hope that they are at the very least using a high interest savings account instead.
If you want to hear more about another lie that we've been told about money, check out this video next. And yeah, with that being said, we'll see you guys next week. You already know the vibes, and yeah, let's go.